Hello, and welcome to my 2024 APA presentation on how to use and administer a contingent visitation schedule in the family courts. Now, this is the presentation I made to the American Psychological Association in 2024 in Seattle. I am representing it on YouTube just to make the information available to everybody. Personally, I feel like those in-person convention type of things are outmoded, no longer necessary, and we have the internet now and we should be using it. So I will be focusing my talks and interventions and information seminars into the YouTube and the internet rather than uh, the old, what I call flatlander kind of thinking of in-person conventions. And so this presentation here, I am representing my 2024 APA talk and using the same exact PowerPoint slides. And I do that, I use my PowerPoint slides to guide my presentations. Sometimes some slides allow me to expand more. Oftentimes I stay more focused on the content of the slides. In this presentation, I stay more focused on the content without much elaboration because I wanted to replicate the two presentations and the information as close as possible. So this is my presentation to the American Psychological Association in 2024 regarding how to use and administer a contingent visitation schedule in the family courts. Now, by way of full disclosure regarding my practice and the contingent visitation schedule, I am a consultant in the family courts, and so I review documents and provide reports into the courts, as well as serve as a second opinion on active assessments and consult assessments in the family courts regarding child custody. I don't do custody kind of evaluations, but I'm a clinical psychologist and provide consultation from clinical psychology regarding the treatment of pathology. And as part of my consultation, I have a number of resources available, including my consulting website, where I have resources available for attorneys, mental health professionals, and for parents, as well as I've written a number of books and booklets regarding the pathology in the family courts. The primary foundational booklet is Foundations, that I see as sort of a diagnostic treatise on the pathology. I describe it at a family systems level, at the personality disorder level, and at the attachment level, and integrate all of that. And so that's Foundations that describes the pathology pretty fully. And then I have additional booklets as well, one of which is the Contingent Visitation Schedule. So the assessment of attachment-related pathology talks a bit about a 6-session assessment protocol. The Contingent Visitation Schedule is available. It's a booklet I've written that describes how to put this together and administer a contingent visitation schedule in the family courts, and then other booklets such as describing the narcissistic parent. So I'll be talking about a contingent visitation schedule, which is one of the booklets that is available. The contingent visitation itself, though, is a standard behavior program using additional principles or using principles from strategic family systems therapy as well. And as a behavior program, the targeted the targeted behaviors are affection, cooperation, and social involvement. Those are the behaviors that we want to see increase. And we're using daily ratings on a 7-point Likert scale to increase those target behaviors. The definitions that are used as part of the behavior program is a successful day is scoring or receiving 4 or higher on all 3 ratings. And then a successful week is 5 successful days in a 7-day period. Now, I want to step back for a second, just look at the definitions for what makes a successful day. When I was initially sort of setting up the structure of the behavior program, I had a question whether I'm using a 7-point Likert scale, whether it should be a 4 or higher, which is like the midpoint, or maybe 3 or higher, because we're not that precise in our ratings. So 3, 4, 5 is normal, 1 and 2 is unsuccessful, and 6 or 7 is very successful. And in assigning the structure into the booklet, I chose the number 4. I said, because that's just kind of the way I am as school behavior programs and things. I like to push a little bit on the more firm side of the requirements, but then I can back off on negotiation, which is what I would recommend doing with this. The program says 4, but a 3, 4, 5 is normal range. And that's what I use in my practice. When I use the rating scale, I say 3, 4, 5 is normal range. 6 and 7 is wonderful, but 1 and 2 is what really is the problem kind of behaviors. And one of the reasons I chose 4 and then compromised back to 3 is to communicate to everybody that's using the contingent visitation schedule that you can adjust things. You can compromise to a degree if you understand behavior programs and things, and negotiate things out, maintaining the structure of the program. That the contingent visitation schedule is for you to use, not for you to be, used by. It's a tool for you to use. And so that's why in the booklet I set it at 4, but I would recommend 3, 4, 5 is normal range. So if you understand behavior programs, you'll understand the contingent visitation schedule. It's also, though, a contingent visitation schedule is also a strategic family systems intervention that alters how the symptom confers power within the family. And the secondary gain or rewards to the allied parent of creating pathology in the child are to manipulate the court's decisions regarding child custody, the spousal psychological abuse of the targeted parent using the child's induced pathology as the weapon, and then to meet the pathological parent's own emotional and psychological needs. So the booklet itself describes the structure of a contingent visitation schedule. However, the booklet is not necessary if you understand standard behavior programs. Today's seminar will provide all of the information that you need to set up and administer a contingent visitation schedule. What the booklet is designed to do is to allow parent litigants to reference a particular structured intervention in their request for orders. So the court's established custody schedule. The schedule will then flex based on child symptoms. And the court must authorize this flexing of the custody schedule that's contingent on the child's symptoms. And so to do that, the court must understand what it is authorizing. So the contingent visitation schedule booklet is simply for parents and attorneys to give to the court and say, this is the structure of the program. Once it becomes known, once it's out there and everybody's doing it, the booklet becomes secondary and will drop away because it's a standard behavior program. So when the court authorizes a contingent visitation schedule, an organizing family therapist will be needed to run it, to implement the contingencies. And the role of that organizing family therapist will be to receive the daily ratings from the parent and record the numbers into an Excel file. So track them, and that'll trigger the contingencies. In addition, though, the organizing family therapist will have weekly sessions with everybody in the family or with the targeted parent and the children to monitor the fidelity ratings during the week in the parent-child family therapy sessions. So they'll talk about, if there was a 1 or 2, what happened, and go through a little bit of applied behavioral analysis and behavior chain interviewing, and sort of verify that the numbers are accurately reflecting the child's relationship behavior. And then the third role will be to implement the program contingencies based on the defined criteria when the child's symptoms rise. So within clinical psychology, and this is an intervention from clinical psychology, treatment, not custody, diagnosis guides treatment. That's true throughout all of healthcare. In terms of clinical psychology and our approach or attitude towards custody, is that in the absence of child abuse, parents have the right to parent according to their cultural values, their personal values, and their religious values. And in the absence of child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. And in the absence of child abuse, to restrict either parent's time and involvement with the child would damage that child's attachment bond to that parent, thereby harming the child and harming the parent. The only question for clinical psychology, and I would offer for everybody involved, is whether there's child abuse. So here's the differential diagnoses regarding all custody cases where there's a child rejecting a parent, a severe attachment pathology displayed by the child. These are your two differential diagnoses. Either the targeted parent is abusing the child in some way, creating the child's directional change in the child's attachment bond. They seek to flee that parent. So we either have physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, or psychological child abuse by the targeted parent. Or it's a false or factitious attachment pathology being created in the child for secondary gain to the allied parent, which is the diagnoses of the shared persecutory delusion, a factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child psychological abuse by the allied parent, with a strongly considered rule out of spouse or partner abuse, psychological, of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as a weapon. So let me take a step aside for a second from describing the contingent visitation schedule to make a point. The patient should never have to explain the pathology to the doctor. And parents in the family courts are explaining the pathology to the doctors. That's just what's occurring in the family courts right now. If you need to be educated about what the pathology is, then you are currently not competent with that pathology by demonstrated need to be educated about the pathology. And I will cite to standards 2.01, 2.04, and to my ethical requirements under 1.04 and 1.05. The purpose of today's talk is not to educate you about the pathology. You should already know. The purpose of today's talk is to educate you about a treatment solution to the pathology in the family courts. And diagnosis guides treatment. So here's a differential diagnosis again. We have the targeted parent or the allied parent. One parent or the other is abusing the child in some way to create the child's symptoms. A contingent visitation schedule is for that diagnosis, a factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child for secondary gain. A contingent visitation schedule is the treatment for a factitious disorder imposed on another, a false attachment pathology imposed on the child for secondary gain to the pathological parent. It is not, a contingent visitation schedule is not the treatment for authentic attachment pathology caused by abusive range parenting by the targeted parent. This is important to understand. The diagnosis guides treatment. The contingent visitation schedule is for factitious disorder. It's not for authentic child abuse. So, now here's a description of a factitious disorder imposed on another from the ICD-11. A factitious disorder imposed on another is characterized by feigning, falsifying, or inducing medical, psychological, or behavioral signs and symptoms of injury in another person, most commonly child dependent, associated with identified deception. The individual seeks treatment for the other person or otherwise presents him or her as ill, injured, or impaired based on feigned, falsified, or induced signs, symptoms, or injuries. So when we have a parent who's inducing false symptoms in the child for secondary gain of deceiving the court regarding the parenting of the targeted parent so that they can manipulate the court's decisions and things. When we have a factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child's psychological abuse, then a contingent visitation schedule is the treatment for that. If we have authentic child abuse by the targeted parent, then the contingent visitation schedule is exactly the wrong thing to do for that. So the question becomes, what is your diagnosis? Okay. That diagnosis guides treatment. So to discuss the contingent visitation schedule then, it involves two integrated models, two integrated approaches to psychotherapy: behavior therapy and strategic family systems therapy. So from a behavior therapy perspective, it's a functional behavioral analysis, FBA. So we identify the functions that's served by the behavior, then we make that behavior ineffective, irrelevant, or inefficient in serving that function. From a family systems perspective, we would look at strategic family systems therapy from Chloe Madonna's Jay Haley, in which the symptom confers power. We then identify how that symptom is conferring power in the family and develop a prescriptive intervention, the contingent visitation schedule, that will alter how that symptom confers power within the family. And when that happens, the symptom will drop away. So, a contingent visitation schedule is a behavioral and strategic family systems intervention, a prescriptive intervention that alters how the symptom confers power within the family. So let's begin by discussing how the contingent visitation schedule from a functional behavioral analysis perspective. What the program does, the contingent visitation schedule, establishes a clear structure for initiating the various phases based on the child's symptoms, the ratings on the outcome measure. So daily ratings on the child on 3 items on a 7-point Likert scale: affection, which is an attachment network, so we're monitoring the attachment, normal range attachment development of the child; cooperation, which is the emotional regulation networks; and social involvement, mood and arousal. And so we're monitoring those 3 symptoms using these daily ratings from the targeted parent. Now, a applied behavioral analysis is the antecedent behavior and the consequence. A functional behavioral analysis adds the function of the behavior. And they're used all the time, mandated in the school system by the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Before anybody can put in a behavior program or any behavior change program in the schools, they have to conduct a functional behavioral analysis. So the school systems get them routinely, and this is a FBA brought over into the family courts. So it's designed to make the behavior ineffective, inefficient, or irrelevant in meeting the function of the behavior. And the function is to meet the allied parent's own psychological needs. So from a functional behavioral analysis, the function of the child's behavior, the child's symptoms of rejecting a parent serves the function of providing the rewards, a secondary gain to the allied parent, of manipulating the court's decisions regarding child custody, and satisfying the revenge motivations of the allied parent. From a strategic family systems perspective, the child's symptoms of rejecting a parent confers power to the allied parent regarding custody and gratifying the spousal revenge motivations. From a strategic family systems perspective, the contingent visitation schedule is designed to address a child who is being triangulated into the spousal conflict through a cross-generational coalition with the allied parent against the targeted parent, resulting in an emotional cutoff in the child's attachment bond to the parent. So there's your three solid foundations in family systems: family evaluation, Murray Bowen; strategic family systems, Chloe Madonis; and then Salvador Minuchin, families and families therapy. All court-involved psychologists should obviously have read these and be competent in family systems if you're working with families. So I'm not going to explain too much about this other than to say that's what we're treating: cross-trials, triangulation, cross-generational coalition. Here's from Salvador Minuchin and Family Healing. This is an exact picture of the pathology right there. So you see a father and a son in an enmeshed coalition against the mother, with the emotional cutoff in the relationship to the mother. In the diagram above that, you see a mother and the son against the father, but there's no emotional cutoff in that. So there is the picture of the pathology that's in the family courts. So a contingent visitation schedule alters how the child's symptoms of rejecting a parent confers power in the family. So when the child's symptoms increase based on the outcome measure, the time with the allied pathological parent goes down, and the time with the normal range targeted parent goes up, based on the symptoms. But when the child is non-symptomatic, normal range based on the outcome measure, then the court-ordered custody schedule is in place, assumed to be 50-50. So stable, and it's 50-50. That's what the court ordered. If the child becomes symptomatic, time with the allied targeted parent goes up, time with the targeted parent goes down until the child's symptoms go away. The narcissistic, borderline, dark personality allied parent is creating a false, factitious attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain to that parent. Now, with a factitious disorder, unless the motivation of the pathological parent to create pathology in the child is effectively removed, then we will always be fighting to protect the child against the manipulative negative influence of the pathological parent. So that's important to understand about the treatment of a factitious disorder imposed on the child. We have a parent who's motivated to create pathology in the child because of all the rewards they're getting. And we can stop or protect the child somewhat from the abusive parenting, but unless we're able to remove that motivation, that parent's always going to be trying to get at that child, and the child's always going to be in the middle, and we're always going to have to be taking steps to protect the child. Diagnosis guides treatment. For the treatment of a factitious disorder imposed on another, we must remove that parental motivation on the child. So we can't be put in a position where we're always trying to protect the child. But once we remove the pathological parent's motivation to create the false pathology in the child, the secondary gain, then the child is out of the middle and no longer needs protection. So that's the treatment for a factitious disorder, and a contingent visitation schedule based on the presence or absence of symptoms is designed to remove the pathological parent's motivation to create the pathology in their child. That's secondary gain. So here's how it's designed to do that. Here's the program structure itself. So we have the definition for a successful day. That's obtaining ratings of 4 or higher, 3, 4, 5, 3 or higher on all 3 of the scales: affection, cooperation, social involvement. A successful week is 5 or more successful days in a 7-day period. So they can even mess up a couple days. That's fine. It's just 5 out of 7 days is a successful week. An unsuccessful week is less than 5 successful days in a 7-day period, which will then trigger a short-term contingent response. The short-term contingent response, if the child is 4 or less successful days in a week, the unsuccessful week will result in a short-term adjustment to the custody timeshare schedule based on the ratings of daily symptoms. The child will remain in the custody care of the normal range targeted parent until 3 consecutive successful days are achieved, at which point the court-ordered custody schedule resumes with no makeup days. So this is what that would look like. On the top there is a successful week. The child has 5 out of 7 days successful with a rating of 3 or higher on all 3 scales. So again, you can see 2 days, the child kind of got a little bumpy of 1s and 2s, but that's considered normal range. That's a successful week. But the second, and so the custody visitation schedule transfers week to week. Now, the second one, though, the child has 3 unsuccessful days, and so that's an unsuccessful week. So when the following week comes, the custody exchange doesn't take place. The child stays with the targeted parent until the child obtains 3 successful days. So you see down there, first day was unsuccessful, but then 3 successful days, and boop, they go back to the normal range schedule. But notice the allied parent will only get 3 days, and then it switches back to the targeted parent because on a week on, sort of week off. And so there's no makeup days regarding that. That parent simply loses that time with the child. Now, if there's a serious breach of the contingent of the relationship, such as runaway behavior or violent behavior, then a long-term contingent response is initiated, and the child remains in the custody care of the normal range targeted parent for 2 weeks, with 3 consecutive successful days needed to resume court-ordered visitation schedule. Now, this right here, those 2 contingencies, is exactly why this is not the treatment for authentic child abuse. If the child is protesting because the targeted parent is abusive, and we say you need to stay with that parent, that's the wrong thing for the treatment of abuse, to say you're not being abused, we're going to. However, if it's a false, factitious attachment pathology being caused by the other parent, the allied parent, then that is the right thing to do. If a pathological parent's producing symptoms in the child, we reduce time with that parent and recover with the targeted parent. So diagnosis guides treatment. Which parent is abusing the child? And we absolutely need to know that. Because for a contingent visitation schedule, when the child says, this is bad, or if they run away or do something, we're going to be attributing that to the pathogenic parenting of the allied parent, not the targeted parent, because of our diagnosis. Diagnosis guides treatment. Our diagnosis needs to be accurate. So, what's your diagnosis? That the contingent visitation schedule is for a factitious disorder imposed on another. Is that your diagnosis? It should be a diagnosis one way or the other. It's either an authentic child abuse or a factitious disorder, psychological child abuse. So how the contingent visitation schedule works to eliminate the secondary gain for the allied parent is first regarding the manipulating the court's decisions regarding child custody. Once with the contingent visitation schedules in place, the allied parent is no longer rewarded with more custody time and instead is punished with less custody time. So it's not working anymore in terms of manipulating the court's decisions. In addition, regarding the second secondary gain or reward of spousal psychological abuse of the targeted parent. Well, now if they produce pathology in the child, the targeted parent gets more time with the child to the benefit, not the harm, of the targeted parent. And third, the secondary gain of meeting the allied parent's own psychological needs. Well, for the narcissistic parent, that's typically the all wonderful parent presentation. But now that's now being labeled as the abusive parent, instead of being, oh, you're the all wonderful, chosen parent. You're now the psychologically abusive parent. So we're reversing that grandiose inflation, and creating pathology in the child now leads to the abandonment that is the borderline trigger. So trying to hold on to the child for fear of abandonment. Well, now they're getting less time with the child. And so it's not working to prevent their abandonment fears. So it's disrupting all of the motivations, all of the secondary gain of that pathological parent to produce pathology in the child. And so the behavior programs, all treatment, should be focused on outcome measures. What is your outcome measure for effective treatment, for the goal accomplishment and for your interventions? The outcome measure I recommend in the family courts are daily ratings by the targeted parent on a 7-point Likert scale for 3 relationship features: affection, which are the attachment networks; cooperation, the emotional regulation networks; and social involvement, mood and arousal. And from my personal experience using these outcome scales, or this outcome measure for child symptoms, is it provides a wealth of information to the psychologist, the treating family therapist, prior to the family entering my family therapy. So they come into the weekly session, but I already know what's happened during the week, 4s and 5s and 3s and 1s and things. In addition, because we're monitoring 3 kind of relationships components, attachment networks and emotional regulation and mood and arousal, I can tell what's kind of going on inside the child. And that was interesting because what happens frequently is that the targeted parent develops their own sort of metric, their own internal calibration for what's a 5 and what's a 3 and what's a 1 and a 2. And they have their own internal calibration, which is validated in the weekly therapy. I'll go through and, this was a 1 or this was a 5. And we talk about why and what was going on to help both verify that the ratings are relatively accurate, but also to help everybody understand and the child understand what's normal range and what the expectations are. So in doing that, the targeted parent develops this kind of metric about what's a 3 and standards, and what's a 3 and what's a 2 and what's a 5. And so that provides me then, with the daily ratings, I can see what's happening on attachment networks and emotional regulation networks and mood and arousal with the child during the week. So I recommend this outcome measure be used consistently, routinely, with all of these custody conflict cases in its treatment. So let me talk for a second about forensic custody evaluations or clinical diagnostic assessments. So forensic custody evaluations are a failed experiment in service delivery to a vulnerable population. And clinical psychology treatment, not custody, needs to return to court-involved custody conflict. I will cite then to the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluations, which found that by an 11-9 margin, a majority of commission members favor elimination of forensic custody evaluations entirely, arguing that these reports are biased and harmful to children, and lack scientific or legal value. At worst, evaluations can be dangerous, particularly in situations of domestic violence or child abuse. I am a clinical psychology consultant in the family courts. I read forensic custody evaluations all the time. That's kind of what I do, my practice. People bring me these reports and for a second opinion on them from clinical psychology. And I am in full agreement with the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on forensic custody evaluations. They should be eliminated entirely. They lack scientific and legal value. They are harmful to children. They are dangerous. These are not my words. They're your words, but they're my words too. So it's a really problematic practice in the family courts. In addition, they found that these members reached the conclusion that the practice is beyond reform and that no amount of training for courts, forensic evaluators, and or court personnel will successfully fix the bias, inequity, and conflict of interest issues that exist within the system. Let me discuss that for a second because we need to return to clinical diagnostic assessments. These forensic custody evaluation experimental approach is a complete and total failure, dangerous to children, lacks scientific, it needs to be eliminated. However, there is now a conflict of interest between the people in psychology conducting the forensic custody evaluations and the need to move back to clinical diagnostic assessments because then they're gone. That's not what they do, and we have to admit that that was a failed approach, which they don't want to do for various financial and career status reasons. So we're currently in a situation of a conflict of interest of needing to fix the problem in the family courts, but having psychologists who are motivated to not fix the pathology and to continue with the current failed mental health system. And I would encourage everyone to listen to up on YouTube the discussion of the New York Blue Ribbon Commission findings by a couple of the commissioners. You can just Google, discussion of New York Blue Ribbon Commission on forensic custody evaluation, and it'll show up. So here is the solution from clinical psychology regarding the pathology in the family courts. There are two litigants, each making cross allegations of abuse by the other parent litigant. So the targeted parent or the allied parent, and maybe the child's symptoms are making an allegation of abusive range parenting against a targeted parent. The targeted parent saying that's not true, delusional, persecutory delusion, it's a false, factitious attachment, the child's psychological abuse against the allied parent. So there's cross allegations of child abuse. We need a clinical diagnostic assessment to determine which parent is abusing the child. That's going to be a disputed diagnosis. We know that. The appellate system for a disputed diagnosis is second opinion. So each party should be allowed to appoint a second opinion consultant through telehealth on the clinical diagnostic assessment. We need to stop the fighting around these children and the appellate system for disputed diagnosis and second opinion. It also provides that both litigants are appropriately represented in the clinical diagnostic assessment. If you just have one psychologist conducting the assessment, there's a potential for all sorts of bias factors, or that they didn't consider the rights or interpret the data, the information relative to each party's positions and concerns. Whereas if you allow each party to put a psychologist also in that situation through telehealth, then we know that each litigant's positions and concerns are being adequately represented in the clinical diagnostic assessment. And then when it comes out to the court, we have maybe three opinions, but they're going to be roughly around the same issue. And it's like a 3-judge appellate panel in the legal system, except it's 3 doctors looking at the pathology and describing why their diagnosis and their treatment plans. And we should hopefully reach a consensus moving forward on that. And then that can guide the court's decisions as well as the treatment plan. So here's what that would look like in its entirety. So this is a resolution of the family court pathology from a clinical psychological approach rather than a forensic custody approach. We have the court and two litigants in the court. We need a diagnostic assessment. Each litigant appoints a second opinion. That information goes back into the court for its decision making, as well as goes out into the treatment. And then the person who's conducting the diagnostic assessment and into the treatment will then have the additional support of one, potentially two, second opinion consultants who were there at the assessment as well. And so that's what a clinical psychology solution to the family court pathology would look like. So with that, that is the contingent visitation schedule for the family courts. At this point in the APA talk, I opened it up for a few questions at the end here. What's critical to understand is the diagnosis guides treatment. And this is a treatment for a specific type of problem, a false, factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child. One of the significant challenges in mental health right now in the family courts is the psychologists are not making diagnoses. They're just not doing that because of forensic custody evaluations. Evaluators kind of got off track on their professional obligations. So as we return to professional standards of practice, because we're below professional standards of practice right now in the family courts, as we return to diagnosis guides treatment and start diagnosing the child abuse, which we're not doing, which is so extraordinarily problematic. But as we return and start we'll be getting this diagnosis of child psychological abuse, a factitious disorder, and we have a treatment for that. But we don't have a treatment if we're not diagnosing the child abuse. So that's the current situation. Is we have treatment available, we have solutions available. Once we want the treatments, once we want to solve things, once we want to return to professional standards of practice. And so with that, I'm going to end my APA 2024 talk and continue to provide solutions into the family courts once people want solutions for the problem in